Hi, I'm Mike Wilson, co-creator and co-founder of the Lion Strategy Group, and I'd like to welcome you to our new weekly podcast, Speak Up, Speak Out. We're living in interesting times in our country. Over the last 6 months, we've dealt with uh, a pandemic response and then a reopen and now another flare-up, along with civil unrest as it relates to the actions of some of our guardians. We've seen that fear and frustration evolve into protests and riots around our country. People believing that their voice is not heard as they feel that they have to employ these extreme measures to be heard. And that was our motivation for producing this podcast, to provide a platform for everyday citizens to speak up and speak out on issues impacting their communities, state, and country. Many believe their voice has been silenced, and many believe that the actions taken by our leaders to address these issues are simply to appease the mass, project a personal agenda, or to minimize the actions of others. And why is that? Well, because they're using the same approach as they have to address previous problems in the past. And we all know that there's not a one size fit all approach to problem solving. Each problem is unique in its own way. Therefore, we have to get down to the root cause and understand the why so that we know who we need to engage in order to address the issues of today. I strongly believe, and we believe here at the Lion Strategy Group, that all of the efforts over the past many years, the reform attempts, going back as far back as the 60s, they've brought about some great things as it relates to laws and policies and police oversight. But I think what we've seen with our current events is that we're dealing with a lot of the same behaviors that we were dealing with 60 years ago. So that would lead, many people to ask, are we dealing with the symptoms or are we trying to address the root cause? Have we simply been applying the Band-Aid approach? And I think it's a little bit of both. I think there has been good intentions with the actions of the past and the efforts. But I think we've been operating within the areas that we know best, which is administration and operations. And those are two of the three systems that exist in any organization, community, governmental structure. What we've not addressed is the human system. So we're going to just start unpacking those things as we provide, a safe environment for authentic, truthful, candid conversations surrounding these issues. So I'd like to welcome you all who are viewing, and I would like to now introduce my business partner and also co-founder of the Lion Strategy Group, Mike Alexander.
Thank you, Mike, very much. Before I start, do you mind giving us a little bit of your background before I kind of pick up?
Well, my background, I'm a retired chief of police. I served for 25 years. I was fortunate in that I only served with two police agencies, but during my time as police chief, I served on many state training boards. And along with you, Mike, as you know, we're two of the three statewide trainers for the Developing Leaders Program in the state of Texas. I chose to retire pretty much at the height of my career, to the confusion of a lot of people, because I wanted to do more for the profession. I wanted to do more for the men and women who serve as first responders. There was a level of frustration in that I felt we were missing the boat and not taking advantage of opportunities right there in front of us. And even though as a sitting chief of police, you can make significant change in your departments, I wanted to push for that change on a broader perspective. So,
Thank you, Mike. Just a little bit about me. My name is Mike Alexander again. I'm originally from a small town in Florida. I came to Texas when I was about 17 years of age and went to a college there in Austin called St. Edward's University, where I got my undergraduate degree and immediately started working for the sheriff's office as a very young man. And I spent about 3 years with Travis County Sheriff's Office before I transferred over to the Austin Police Department. And I spent the last 25 years with Austin PD, my last assignment being the sergeant over what we call the Continuing Education Training Division and the Leadership Command College. I left Austin after 25 years and went over to the Inspector General's office. It was a statewide investigation division where I had 30 officers reporting to me, and they were strategically located throughout the state of Texas. After leaving there, after about 4 years, I went to East Texas and became the chief of police for a city of Palestine, Texas. I spent about 11 months as the chief before I was asked to sit in the city manager seat for 6 weeks that turned into almost 3 years. I eventually left Palestine and ended up in a community in the Denton County area called Corinth. I spent about 6 months there helping them prepare themselves for an incoming chief. Then I left there and went to a East Texas town, back in East Texas again, to another city to do the same identical thing, help them prepare for an incoming chief. Like Mike, as he stated, I am one of 3 of the developing leaders, trainers for the Texas Police Chiefs Association. And I've also done a lot of training nationally for a litany of people: Department of Justice, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, a outfit out of Florida called the Multi-Jurisdictional Counter-Drug Task Force Training Center, and also St. Pete College. And I can go on and on about the organizations that I've done a lot of training for, but I just appreciate this platform that Mike and I have put together to really talk about the issues. And as a Black male, and some of the things that are going on today, it really, really impacts me on both sides, because I understand the police. I truly do understand them, as I am a member of that fraternity, and it's been for almost 40 years. So I totally get it. And I know that we are ill-equipped to handle some of the problems that society has dumped and the lapse of police officers. But I also get it as a Black male and seeing the systemic nature of racism that are embedded in police departments, and have been there my entire career and have observed some of the most egregious things as it relates to African Americans or people of color and the police. And I understand the whole legacy thing around trauma and how it dates back to the slave trade, and how policing was formed in the 1700s back in Charleston, South Carolina, where they called them the slave patrol, or another name called the patty rollers. And they were designed strictly to hold down the slave trade. And that issue evolved into what policing is today. While that was happening in South, there was a different kind of formation happening in northern parts of the United States, but it was still the same. It still was holding down minorities. And, being a member of policing, I am just appalled, saddened, frustrated, and sometimes I'm not even sure how to feel as it relates to some of the issues. So I am struggling around this stuff because I want to talk about it, and I want people to talk about it, and I want people to ask me questions about it, and I want people to stand in the gap and be willing to talk about it. I want police departments to admit that we have made a lot of mistakes. But I also want our government to recognize that they have not prepared our local law enforcement officers to be able to handle some of society's most egregious issues. And every time a police officer do something that he or she shouldn't do, we as administrators are quick to throw that person to the wolves. Should some of them be terminated? Yes. Should some of them be incarcerated? Yes. But I also believe that we have set most, if not all, law enforcement officers and departments up for failure. And something needs to change. Otherwise, this vicious cycle will continue. So that's just a little bit about me and my introduction. I want to introduce to the world a very good friend of mine and colleague, Carrie O'Donnell. Carrie and I met each other 5, 6, 7 years. I don't know how long ago, but we are both Enneagram enthusiasts. She just happened to be a lot better at it than I am. So I'll shut up and allow Carrie to introduce herself.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So I'll just give a little bit of my background. I started out working for the Council for International Exchange of Scholars, and I worked for the United States Institute of Peace. And then I served for 13 years as president of the Maurice Falk Medical Fund and the Falk Philanthropic Foundations in Pittsburgh. And my training, I'm certified and accredited Enneagram professional teacher and coach. I'm certified as a somatic experiencing practitioner, and I'm a certified conflict management coach. So I currently serve in a volunteer capacity as a dialogue facilitator for victims of violent crime for the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections in the dialogue program. And I also work as a consultant to organizations, and I have a private coaching practice where I work with individuals one-on-one. And I also have the distinction of having been arrested for an assault on a police officer, which was a felony it was eventually reduced to a misdemeanor, probably in no small part because I'm a white female, and it was, pled down from a felony to a misdemeanor. And I think that experience was very formative for me in recognizing what was going on with the officer who arrested me and how his reaction was out of proportion to what was actually happening in the current situation. And so when I sensed that he was being triggered, then I was triggered, and our nervous systems were just very dysregulated. And he was clearly responding way out of proportion to the actual situation in the moment. So I became very interested in that, and particularly in trauma and the role of the nervous system in trauma. And that's when I became trained and certified in the nervous system. I had been studying the Enneagram for many decades, but the missing piece for me was the nervous system, understanding how it works, how it functions, and how to regulate the nervous system, especially for people who have had trauma and accumulated stress that builds up in the nervous system that gets triggered and causes people to overreact or even underreact, right? So, from my perspective, due to the unpredictable nature of their jobs, many police officers say that they rely on their gut instincts. They really have to do that. And what they're essentially referring to is their nervous system. And for all of us, the number one job of our nervous system is to protect us. And it does this by processing sensory information in the environment. and it's processing it in nanoseconds. So, for example, if we put our hand on a hot stove, on a red hot stove, we're jerking it away involuntarily. It's an involuntary action. Because if we waited for the message to travel up our hand into our brain and for our brain to process what's the temperature of that oven, we would have burned our hand pretty significantly. So the nervous system has these automatic responses, and depending on the proximity of the threat, the intensity of it, and the timing, the nervous system is going to respond. And it has 5 primary ways of doing that. One is, engaging with others if it's not so big of a threat or if it's not intense. Another is the fight response, the flight response, which would be the stove when we withdraw our hand. That's the flight, we're fleeing from the threat. And then freeze and collapse if the freeze goes on too long. And when we look at nature, we can see how other mammals favor one response over another. So the opossum will go into a freeze, right? And they play dead. And this strategy is very effective to evade a predator because they will lose interest in something they believe has become sick or injured. And so they lose interest and walk away. A deer will obviously run away or flee. And zebras are another story. They fight. A zebra will fight, and that's the reason why they can't be domesticated. So we as humans have the whole range of protective responses available to us in our autonomic nervous system. And pretty often our past experiences are what shape and have a strong influence on how our nervous system is going to respond in some situations. And so as I discovered and what happened with me and the police officer who arrested me, stress accumulates in the body when the energy that was mobilized to respond to a threat gets trapped. So these thwarted protective responses can be triggered repeatedly in the future. And so we've all seen this in the news where we can clearly see police officers who are overreacting in situations where their response is out of proportion to what is actually happening in the moment. And their body is responding to accumulated past threats as opposed to the reality of the current situation. So this is the point where they've essentially become hijacked by their nervous system. And so from my perspective, officers need to be able to recognize when this is happening to them or to their fellow officers and learn to utilize skills to help regulate those responses. So I believe that we have a responsibility to teach police officers about the role of their nervous system and how it operates, especially under accumulated and traumatic stress, and provide them with skills and practices that they can use to keep it functioning in a healthy and reliable way. And I just want to mention that there are 3 broad categories of threats to which all of our nervous systems respond. The first is threats to our safety and our security, which police officers probably face on a daily basis. The second are threats to our sense of worthiness and autonomy. And the third are threats to our relationships and our connections with others. And so in that sense, I think it's important to understand that there's a clear distinction between a real threat and a perceived threat. And this is sort of where the Enneagram comes in, because perceived threats are habitual interpretations that we all developed in childhood that are related to our early emotional attachments. And they will vary by individual person or police officer. So, for example, some officers may react when they feel disrespected, or when their autonomy is called into question, or when they're feeling indispensable. These perceived threats are very subjective, which is why, we all see things very differently in relational interactions. So, for those who are not familiar with it, the Enneagram is an extraordinarily accurate tool for helping police officers to learn to recognize and identify their individual and habitual perceptions of threat that may lead to overreaction or even underreaction, a freeze. So you see one of your fellow officers overreacting, but you're in a freeze, so you don't speak up, right? So either way, these are dysregulated nervous systems. So by using the Enneagram and somatic experiencing, we can equip police officers with the tools and the skills to keep their nervous systems and their gut instincts functioning in a healthy way as a resource and an ally. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. That's just in you sharing about, the Enneagram and the nervous system and all of those things. I know a lot of my reflection over the past couple of months has been on, I never want to label anything. I just think we get into trouble if we start applying labels to a situation, because we know that every issue and every problem is more complex than that, especially if it's dealing with human beings. So we've heard the term systemic racism. We've heard, a multitude of reasons why that people are pushing it out. But I think, and I kind of just want to connect some dots from what Mike shared and what you shared, is I think we would be safe, and correct me if I'm wrong, in saying that what we're dealing with is legacy trauma from two different aspects. One, from our minority communities that have been impacted with the violence historically and the oppression historically, but also from our police officers. I can't tell you how many times we've gone into police departments and the stories that we hear, especially, and we're not hearing it from the rookie officer because they're brand new. They're very idealistic. They're just hard chargers ready to go. But the folks that have been there for 10 plus years, 15 plus years, you start hearing these stories where they're still holding on to either past leadership and those decisions or how they were treated, past calls, and what happened if it was a traumatic experience. So it got me to start thinking that we've gotten pretty good in law enforcement. If we have like a child death, or we have just a very traumatic event, an officer involved shooting, or an officer seriously injured, or like what we saw in Dallas a couple of years ago with the officers being ambushed, well, we're going to provide CISM and other resources to debrief and those things, which is awesome. But here's what we don't do. Officers daily, multiple times daily in some areas, respond to major accidents, fatality accidents, respond to death investigations that are natural deaths. So they're seeing these things, and if I'm understanding you correctly, if they can't process that stuff out in a positive way, that's going to build and build and build, and that's going to minimize that space between the stimuli and the response. Correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So really, if we kind of stripped all the labels off of it and all the political agendas or personal agendas and all that, what we're dealing with is legacy trauma, just from a couple of different perspectives.
Yes.
So I think that at least narrows the scope of what we have to focus on. Am I right?
Yes, I agree. I think it makes it more manageable. And we have incredible tools now and skills to help people work with accumulated traumatic stress in the nervous system.
Right. And these are things I was probably, outside of Mike Alexander, probably the only other chief that utilized the Enneagram in making all of my departments take it, and we would keep a spreadsheet, and we would share what our personality types were, and we would share, here's how best to communicate with me, or here's how I best will communicate with you. So, kind of that respect piece. This is so you can meet me where I'm at, but I also want to meet you where you are. But what we have found is that there's just stark resistance to incorporate. There's always a lot of excuses on why they won't. Well, we've got to think about HIPAA, or we have to think about, um, uh, morale issues, or you hear the response, if you want to get to know me, just come and talk to me. Well, my response to that, all I'm going to see is a totally different person, because you're going to project who you want me to see. Because you're probably a different person at home than you are at work, and you're probably a different person when you're with your friends. So, you know, so that's a challenge, a challenge for us, because uh, we're real good at making excuses on not to incorporate new things. But what really blew my mind is earlier this week, we moved my son in to college, and he's playing football. He's a freshman this year, and the team chaplain spoke with all of the parents and the players, and spoke about how they're focused on developing the individual. And she starts moving it a little bit further, and saying, we're going to teach you life skills. We're going to help you adjust, through this young adulthood. Oh, and by the way, and all of you are going to take the Enneagram assessment. So if it's good for a college campus and a college football program, why is it not good enough for our police officers or our dispatchers or our firefighters that are out there and dealing with those things, when we know that by the utilization of the Enneagram, that, it gives us an idea of, for the lack of better terms, level of mastery or level of health. And it will show some of those red flags where we can intercede before it gets to a Minneapolis incident or worse. So just a few thoughts for me, on that. But your comments and Mike's comments really resonated, because this whole situation has really impacted me, and I've found myself getting angry, because if you know anything about the history, it's like, here we go again. We're dealing with the same stuff that we dealt with back in the 60s. We're dealing with the same stuff we dealt with in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And Rodney King really resonates with me, because I was a young officer shortly after that incident. So with that, Mike, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I have a question for Carrie. Carrie, you talked about the perception of the perceived threat, and it's very subjective based on our personality type. Can you or can we make that more objective than subjective? And is that based off of our level of health, or where is that subjectivity coming from? And because I would love to be able to turn that from a subjective part of who I am to a more objective, so I can be more precise when I see that threat, and I don't take action that I should not be taking.
Right. So the Enneagram is a really powerful, accurate tool, and it has many components to it. And essentially, it's a map of how our nervous system got wired at a young age. So personality is fully formed by the age of 5 or 6 or so. And the Enneagram gives us an enormous amount of information. Once you learn your type structure, it tells you what is your worldview. And that's important, because we all have a bias of attention. So we're going to look for all of the evidence, this is happening automatically, that supports our worldview. And so we all see a slice of reality. This is reality, right? But we see this much of it. because we have a worldview and our nervous system is scanning for evidence that supports our worldview. That's number one. Number two, it tells you what is your self-identity. How do you see yourself? And the nervous system clings to our self-identity because it feels safe. And so any threat to our self-identity is going to feel very dangerous to the nervous system, and you'll get a lot of reactivity going on. So, for example, I'm a type 9 and I see myself as a peaceful person. But if somebody starts pushing my buttons and tries to draw me into a conflict, I get dysregulated because conflict feels dangerous to me as a type 9. And it also tells us what we habitually seek and what we habitually avoid, right? So I'm always seeking harmony, togetherness, peace, contentment, and I avoid conflict. And so you can start to see then when conflict comes up, then and this is true for all of us, when the thing that we're avoiding, when we come face to face that the thing that we avoid because it feels dangerous, we also have a defense mechanism. And each type has a defense mechanism when this shows up. And so you start to see these patterns, and these are the patterns that got wired into the nervous system. And so it's really about working with the nervous system to sort of work through these things. I like to compare it to when pilots were first starting to fly airplanes and they had the joystick, right? When they go into a nosedive, what do you think their instinct was with that joystick?
To pull up on it.
Pull back, right? Pull back on the joystick. Worst thing you can do. Why? Because you're just plummeting towards the earth and you're going to crash and burn. What they learned to do is push the joystick forward and accelerate even faster towards the earth because it's the only way out of the nosedive, right? You need to accelerate and pull out of the nosedive. So that's where we hear that saying that the only way out is through. Right? And it's the same thing with whatever's going on in our nervous system. When we get triggered, when somebody pushes our buttons and we start to react, that's exactly where we have to go. We have to go to where the reaction is taking place in our body, in our nervous system. And Peter Levine talks about how the only way to resolve trauma is to learn to tolerate what feels intolerable in your body, what's going on in reaction within your own body. And that's really, the only way out is through. And it feels, when we get triggered, we all know what it feels like to get triggered. It feels horrible. We feel awful. It feels chaotic. It feels like a lot of energy. We don't know what to do with it. And it really can be intolerable.
Right.
But that's exactly where we have to work with it.
Well, the other part is as a 6, and that word subjective is so ambiguous. And it scares me because I want to be clear. I want to be right. I want to make sure that when I move towards something, I'm doing it for the right reasons. And I know exactly what stands before me. But the words like perceive and subjective as a 6, that's very unclear, and it's not safe to me. So how do I get around that? What do I do as a 6? Because there are a lot of police officers that I know that are 6s, and they struggle with the same thing. So how do we work through something like that? Is that possible?
Yes, so there's two things, and one is the Enneagram itself is an extraordinary map. So that once you learn the Enneagram and you know someone's type structure, you know what all those components are. You know that 9s are triggered by conflict. You know that what a 9 considers, or the sense that I don't know their worthiness called into question. So the Enneagram can help you understand what the other type structures look like, what might trigger another type structure from their perspective. You will understand how that person is to themselves. That's number one. And number two is to start working with what's happening in your nervous system in reaction to unpredictability and uncertainty. You're going to get some reaction in your nervous system because that feels dangerous to your type structure.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Mike, any other questions around that?
Well, so there's a ton of questions. It's like, kids, why, why? But the one thing that is just sticking with me, and I would love to know y'all's thoughts, is we are effectively dealing, if you strip away all of the politics around it and all of the agendas around it, we are dealing with the same behaviors today as 60 years ago. And that's my first question. Why? We've invested so many resources in developing programs, developing training, um, bringing about new legislation, bringing about new policies. Organizations like CALIA, which is a national accreditation body, and all these state recognition programs that have created these best practice policies. So we've done all of that. Why are we still dealing with the same behaviors that should have been addressed when we first tackled this problem?
Well, from my perspective, I think that people, there's a great book, and someone's mentioned a book before, and it's called White Fragility, how white people are afraid to talk about the issues, the real issues around race. And I give you a prime example of that happened to me this week. So I'm teaching the Developing Leaders course in the police department up here in the Metroplex. And one of the case studies had an issue where white officers were being pushed out of a unit and replaced by people of color and gender. And so when they went through the case study to figure out what happened, they skated around the elephant in the room. They would not talk about the fact that their morale was low because the white males were being pushed out and African Americans were being pulled in. And the white males no longer wanted to work with those that were being pulled in. And it had been a good old boy system for so many years. And someone made a decision to change the structure or the complexity of that division. And instead of us dealing with the elephant in the room, they chose to talk around it. So as a facilitator of that discussion and being an African American, I said, guys, everything you said was right, but you're still leaving the elephant in the room. It's not fair to the officers that are being pushed out, they're white males. We know that politics are at play here, but it's also not fair to the African Americans and the females that are being pulled in, and the white males who are still in the unit don't want to work with them. And instead of dealing with or addressing the elephant in the room around race and equity, you guys are skating around it. The only way we're going to solve these issues is that we're willing to have a crucial conversation. And you guys are unwilling to do so. So once I put it out there that way, they talked about it a little bit, but they still would not take a deep dive. So, I don't know what's impeding us from just having the discussion and admitting that we're ignorant to certain issues so that we can educate one another, because there's ignorance on both sides. But we need to get at the head of the table or around the table so we can have that discussion. And I'm so frustrated that no one's really willing to do that. So that's my take on it, Mike.
All right, Carrie, any thoughts?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is it could be that people are afraid of their own reactivity. If they start having some kind of reactivity around this topic, that they won't know how to work with it. Because a lot of times we're just unskilled at our own reactivity, right? And then the second thing is a lot of these tools and skills are pretty recent. You know, Mike, you talked about how you were surprised to find that the Enneagram is now being used on college campuses, and it hasn't even been taught in institutions of higher education until very recently, and even then it's quite rare. And even psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, many of them have never heard of the Enneagram. And then we have all of these advances in neuroscience where we, you know, are making leaps and bounds in our understanding of the nervous system and how to work with it, and the vagus nerve and the dorsal vagal, the polyvagal theory. All of these are fairly recent that, again, haven't quite made it into the mainstream and are just beginning to be taught in institutions of higher education. So that's the good news, is we've got these wonderful tools now that are available to us, to do something different, right?
Yeah, and I believe we would all agree we have to approach this differently this time. You know, it's this isn't something that's going to go away. I mean, we're living in a society now where people know how to mobilize and they know how to project their voice, and you know, it's time for us to start hearing that, recognizing that, and we've got some feedback going on. So, um, and as we start recognizing um, that, number one, in my book, I think we have to acknowledge two things. One, we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, and that is that policing historically has been involved in some pretty horrendous acts against people, and not just against all people, but against certain segments of our country. I think second, we have to acknowledge that we have gotten away from what our original role and intent in society was, which is we are reflective of the desires of our community, you know, ultimately under the umbrella of our Constitution. And unfortunately, we have adopted a mentality that we know best when it comes to policing strategies and philosophies. And anything that you've ever read, if you've read about the origin of policing in America, if you've read about the you know, any of the um, events surrounding, you know, the life and times of Sir Robert Peel, who's considered the father of modern day policing, it was never meant to be that way. But through egos and attitudes, we made it so. And we justified it with terms like the war on drugs. Well, effectively, what that was is a war on our own people, and not recognizing what was driving the drug problem, you know, and how dynamics had changed, and our country had changed, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I think that's where we have to start with those acknowledgments, and then at least from there, you know, folks that are feeling the pain, it's not going to take the pain away, but at the very least, they can go. They're finally admitting it. They're finally saying it, and maybe at that point, they're going to be more willing to actively engage in cooperation on, okay, what's our next step. So, uh, Carrie, I'll go to you because I think Mike is having a connection problem.
Okay. Yeah, I think that people need to recognize how this work can benefit them, you know, because otherwise there's really no motivation. And I think we can all recognize when our buttons are being pushed, when we're going into reactivity, whether in our professional life or in our personal life. And when people can work with that and start to see the benefits of being able to, when I'm in reactivity or I'm being triggered or my buttons are being pushed, how to work with that in both my personal as well as professional life. I think that's the point where they really become motivated to learn more and to learn the skills, for how to work with this.
Right. So if we were to take this to a next step, and and I spoke in very general terms, and for those who view this podcast, this is called a little foreshadowing to the panel discussion coming up. What do you think, Carrie, needs to be the very first step? If we're talking about clearing this pathway so we can heal and truly police in the desired manner in America, what do you think in your mind is the first step that we have to take?
I think in regards to training, to give police officers an immediate sense experience of, and it can be a something of their own choosing, a time when they got triggered, a time when their buttons were pushed, and to have a direct experience of how to work with that and experience it for themselves. I think that would be the most powerful step, the first step to take.
Yeah, and just so in add-on, how do we achieve that when there's so much emotion surrounding the defund uh, police? Because and along with that, there's so many different definitions that people are operating from on the defund the police initiative. So how do we ensure that we can bring that training in? What's that balance? What do you think our communities are looking for to to say, hey, yeah, we're going to continue to pony up to provide this?
Right. I would hope that if communities understood that we are taking a different approach, I think everybody agrees that different kind of training, because I think it's very obvious when we watch the news that officers are acting far out of proportion to what's actually happening. It's very clear when you watch videos, if someone's running away, it's just clear that they're overreacting. Everybody can see that. And so that's the issue, is how do we address that knee-jerk overreacting, being hijacked by the nervous system in the moment? I think that's the most critical piece to work on in the immediate future. And I think people would understand that because it's so visual. We can see it for ourselves on the videos that are out there.
Right. And I think that speaks to the biggest disconnect between our community and our police officers, is that the officers will take an action and they immediately go into justifying mode.
Right.
Well, you just don't understand.
Right.
You've never done what we've done. You don't know what we were dealing with. I feared for my life. I feared for my safety, which could very well be true. But I was a police officer for a long time, and I learned real early in my career, you can fight someone into the backseat of a car, or you can talk them in to the backseat of the car. The only difference is how you approach that scenario, the mindset that you carry going into that call. If you're pissed off and you're wanting to fight, you're going to get a fight.
Right.
And it's so we feel that we have to defend, and we start throwing up all the statistics like, out of all of the police encounters, only what is it, 0.03 is the latest one that I think I heard come out. Only 0.03 results in the use of force or the use of significant force. And of that, force involving black males is much lower than, say, Caucasian males. And they totally miss it because they're trying to justify their acts, and they're not looking at the context of everything that's going on. This whole notion of legacy trauma, people just want to bypass like it never happened.
Right.
So I'm assuming that's because we don't want to lean into that pain and push through it so that we can pull out of that nosedive.
That's right. And that's why it might be beneficial to start with ways and circumstances where police officers find themselves being triggered, their buttons are being pushed, reactivity in a lesser circumstance. You know, you could start with something like, my child dumped the whole can of paint all over my living room floor. Okay, yeah, you're going to have some reactivity there, right? And so that's where you start working, because you have to move at the pace of the nervous system. You can't get out ahead of the nervous system. You're going to shut it down. So, you know, it would probably be a good idea to start working with officers' personal lives. Where are they getting triggered? Where are their buttons being pushed in their personal lives? And start there, work there. Right?
And we talk a lot about that a lot of the officers' problems may not originate in the workplace.
Right.
Very well may originate at home, but by gosh, it's going to manifest in the workplace just because of the nature of what they do. You know, they see man's inhumanity to man, and no one has disputed the difficulty of what they do. I believe all Americans, you know, everyone in this country across the board, you know, deep down in their soul, appreciate the fact that, you know, they're there 24/7 and that they're showing up. They just don't agree with all of the behaviors surrounding that.
Yes, and you know, officers want to be able, they need to be able to rely on their gut instincts and their nervous system. So to me, it's about keeping your nervous system healthy, like your service revolver, your service weapon. You keep it clean, you keep it, you know, oiled, whatever it is. You want to be able, your nervous system is a tool, it's an ally, and you want it to be functioning properly and in a healthy way. And so really teaching police officers about their nervous system, the role of the nervous system, how it functions, when it can get overwhelmed, when they can be hijacked by their nervous system. They really need to understand that, because it's a tool for them in the field. It's an ally, and you want to keep it healthy, and functioning.
Right. And so over the last decade, there's been this big push on physical wellness.
Mm-hmm.
But the more and more that I learn and just through experience and we get wisdom, you know, that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. Everything in my perspective starts with the emotional and the mental well-being of the individual, because that's going to drive the physical health. That's going to drive everything else. And officers aren't getting in trouble because they can't chase a suspect a mile in a foot pursuit. That's not why they're going to jail or causing riots or any of that. It's that cognitive process where they're going from, oh, this happened, I'm immediately responding, but they're responding based off of the, you know, the established beliefs and all of those things. So they're basically in autopilot, and that's scary.
Right. Yes. Yes. That's when they get hijacked. Exactly.
Yeah. So we're in agreement when we say, and I'll let Mike chime in. He's trying to get his connection back up. When we say that we have to place it, if we want to rewrite this story, we have to at the forefront place a premium and a priority, in my perspective, on two things. The first is we have to stop selecting our police officers based off of technical competencies, because we can teach you that stuff. You have to have a minimum IQ. We get that. But how do you align with the talents, the motivations, and the behaviors with the position? And we don't do that. We have it backwards. We hire for the technical skills, and we operate off the assumption that we can teach that other, when it should be the other way around. But second, the top priority needs to be on the mental and the emotional health. And that's where we have to have a system in place where we can, in real time, kind of have a running health report card, if, for the lack of better terms, so that we can intercede when the problems are penny problems and they don't become these $100 bill uh, issues that we've got to deal with. Is that, am I tracking down the same road as what you're thinking or what your thoughts are?
Yeah, and I think officers' willingness to be receptive to this type of training, skill development, practicing these skills, right? Their receptivity to that. Yeah.
Awesome. Mike, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I'm just really listening in and just kind of thinking that thank God I do have some knowledge around what Carrie is talking about, because only God knows what I would be doing right now if I did not have some knowledge around the issue. Because I would tell you that it really took me back to my childhood. Um, and my negative interaction with law enforcement and how my family was treated by law enforcement, and me being a cop at the same time. And I'm watching Chauvin with his knee casually on this man's neck, and he's saying, "I can't breathe." And Chauvin it didn't phase him one iota. And I mean, vivid pictures came up in my mind at that time, and they're difficult for me to let them go now. And they were gone for the most part until that situation occurred. And so here I am now, every day, trying to figure out what do we need to do to address this issue, because white America just do not understand. They absolutely are ignorant to the issues and the trauma of African Americans, or people of color, and how we have truly been affected by this issue. And and you got Black officers who are in police departments now are being silent. And the reason they're being silent because they know it's about self-preservation. And if they really spoke their hearts, they would be ostracized and possibly out of a job in some shape, form, or fashion. So they just say nothing. And they just get quiet, or they merge, or they hide within the police department, hoping that this thing will eventually go away, so some form of normalcy will come back. That's why part of the reason you're not hearing a lot from the Black male and or female in police departments. But there's some way we got to create safety within these agencies to where they can release that trauma, because what's required here is to be able to talk about it so we can purge it. And what they're doing is stuffing it deeper and deeper within their system. And Mike, I heard you say this, that at some point we're going to see the ugliness, the dysfunctional, what I call dysfunctional coping strategies. They're going to lash out on somebody else. And when they lash out, it has nothing to do with the person that they're lashing out on. It has something to do with something happened to them a while back. And stuff is coming out now. And that's the ignorance of police departments in addressing these issues. And so that's why I like this podcast idea of speaking up and speaking out about the real issues, because this is where it starts, talking about it so that we can start the process of figuring out how to train our police officers to be able to regulate themselves in the heat of the battle, and not only regulate themselves, but help regulate the other officers that are with them, and not be afraid to speak into another cop when they see that person's nervous system being attacked. And we are doing none of that at all. So those are the challenges that we will continue to revisit if we don't get there and start doing something about it.
Yeah, you're spot on, and we could talk all night about this. But yeah, I learned young the best way to attack the elephant in the room are small bites. And I do believe that we took our first small bite. I look forward to our panel discussion on July 5th and 15th. And Carrie, I'm excited about the panel. And I just want to thank you for coming back for another one.
Thank you.
Yes. And, we're very fortunate to be working with you and just with all of your talents and your knowledge. This is going to have to be a true community effort. No one person is going to have the solution. Now, what I will say, and this may come across as arrogance, is that there is a solution, and the three of us operate within that solution. It all comes down to uh, understanding the human system and how to function and how to develop and how to lead the human system. And that's where the focus needs to shift. So, with that, unless any of you have any closing comments, we will wrap for episode 1. And so I'll open it up to Carrie and Mike. Any last comments before we close out this show?
I just want to say thank you very much for hosting me here. I'm very excited about the work you're doing, and I'm looking forward to participating in more discussions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Mike?
I have nothing. Thank you.
All right. So I would just like to remind you all that this is going to be a weekly podcast. So you'll be able to find it on the Lion Strategy LLC YouTube channel and on our Lion Strategy LLC LinkedIn page, as well as other places where podcasts are distributed. It's an honor to serve all of you. And even though we are retired, we take our oath that I took over 25 years ago, and Mike took well over almost 40 years ago to a heart, which is to our last dying breath, we're going to serve mankind, and we're going to uphold the ethics and the code of what it means to not just be a police officer, but a servant of our public and a servant of our society. So enjoy your evening. Thank you both, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.